Good afternoon, and welcome to the Becker's 13th Annual Meeting virtual event. We are so excited to have you join us for today's featured session, Reimagining the Future of Surgical Services. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. You will find a few engagement tools on your dashboard. Please be sure to check out our resources section and fill out our event survey. Finally, this session is being recorded and will be available on demand following today's event. We will send you instructions on how to access the on-demand recordings once the event concludes. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's program by introducing our presenter, John Scholl, Vice President of Operations for Corewell Health. Since 2015, John has served as Vice President of Operations for Corewell Health, leading the team who maintains the smooth, efficient, and safe operation of 85 inpatient and ambulatory surgical rooms, as well as respiratory, endoscopy, and anesthesiology support for the delivery system. John brings to this role significant operational experience in process improvement, business analysis, quality, safety, and team development. John joined Corewell Health in 2014 to lead the system-wide supply chain function with responsibility over sourcing, contracts, materials management, and logistics. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to John to begin today's presentation.
"100 robots in 10 years. My name is John Scholl. I'd like to thank the Becker's Group for inviting me here to be able to present our story. I'll further introduce myself, not as who I am today, but who I was when I began my robotics journey. Around 2016, I had just stepped into my role as Vice President of Surgical Services. I was new to surgical services. I had heard about robots, but I didn't know a lot about them. I had read in some hospital administrator magazines that they cost more per procedure, they resulted in longer OR times, and they had questionable outcomes, especially with regard to kind of the dominant procedure type of laparoscopic surgery. So I didn't know a lot at the time, but I was curious. And then hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will end up finding more about who I am today as a result of the robotic journey that I've been on. So today we'll cover a few different things. One is the evolution of a Da Vinci program, how you gain alignment, how you can accelerate your program with financial and staffing wins, and then also forecasting, looking at what your mix of surgeries is going to be in the future and how you might forecast your fleet needs as a result. I like to define programs using a concept called an S-curve. And an S-curve, the vertical axis, you have kind of performance or the benefits, and on the horizontal axis, you have time. And typically in an S-curve, you have kind of starting out flat, then you have an inflection point or some sort of catalyst that results in a period of exponential growth, and then it ultimately flattens out. A lot of organizations go through this. Companies like Amazon and Netflix have been through these kind of S-curves before, sometimes multiple S-curves. And sometimes these S-curves take a really short amount of time, like the whole thing could start and finish in a year, or sometimes they take 5 to 10 years to unfold. And I like to think of an S-curve in terms of a robotic program. And so for us, our inflection point, our first point, was the donation of a philanthropy robot, which many of hospitals in the US got their start in robotics the same way. That led to some exponential growth for us at the time compared to what we had. We ended up picking up 3 SIs during that time. We formed a committee called the Robotic and Minimally Invasive Committee, and we had a volunteer medical director. Our RAMIS committee was 3 people, myself, the medical director, and one of the other surgery administrators. But we experienced some great growth during that time and really leveraged those robots across multiple service lines. But then ultimately, like most programs, they end up hitting a plateau where the amount of incremental growth just is not the same as what it had been during that period of explosion. And we were experiencing that. That's about when I came into my role. And so we had started hearing about more about tools that were available to us through Intuitive. And some of our team went to a Da Vinci 360 event where they heard from hospital leaders who were talking about their programs. They heard from surgeons that were delivering some really remarkable results and outcomes. Starting to debunk some of these myths that we had heard in the past or that I had read about. And so this ended up being a really big catalyst for us. We basically wanted to replicate that and bring that same kind of enthusiasm and excitement back into our health system. So we ended up creating our own summit, which we did in 2000, around the end of 2016. And we brought together a broad group of surgeons. We assembled our C-suite executives, so the CMO, CFO, the CEO, the Chief Operations Officer, heads of quality, brought them in and allowed our physicians, our surgeons, to be able to tell their story directly to the C-suite. We also had a keynote speaker, which is someone that we had observed at the 360 and another hospital administrator, and said, can you come in and be our keynote speaker and tell this story? Because we want our teams to be able to see that other hospitals are further along on their robotic journey than we are. It led to some exponential growth for us, just like you typically see in these S-curves. We ended up adding 14 new robots of the current generation. We were able to replace our older generation SIs. We formed a new kind of reinvigorated advanced robotic and minimally invasive surgery committee that had many more members, including C-suite engagement. We had a paid medical director by this time for robotics, a dedicated program coordinator. We boosted our C-suite engagement directly into the robotics committee as well as through the summit and ongoing needs. We got data analytics support, especially for quality data, which was fantastic. We tapped into the ecosystem that Intuitive has, so things like Genesis and also the CHA, the Custom Hospital Analytics program, that is like a data registry for MIS, and it gives us data back about how we're doing relative to adoption and outcomes and cost and OR performance relative to the national benchmark. Incredibly valuable information. We built a regional robotics committee, and we ended up acquiring an SP during that time. So we had fantastic growth. At the end of that first summit that we did, though, right when we first held it, the first day was all about storytelling. The next 2 days were for a smaller group to assemble, mainly surgeons and surgery leadership, to say, what do we want our robotics program to be when we grow up? How are we going to define that, and what should it be? The team did a great job. I came in late on the second day that they were finishing. We had the C-suite that was coming back in to get a final report out at the end of the day. And yet the team was struggling. They had all this great information they had collected, but they didn't know how to synthesize it and articulate it into a way that would resonate with the C-suite. So I had had some exposure previously to working on programs like this and defining them using a tool called a maturity model. And so we developed this maturity model at the end of our summit and shared it with our executives. And what this maturity model had was 4 columns for stages. Stage 1, which is like the infancy of a program, all the way out to world class. And then on the left side, the swim lanes or the rows, these are the attributes that are important to a program. Most programs, including robotics, are not successful because of one element. They need multiple things to be successful in order to support the program. And we knew that was the case in robotics. So in addition to things like clinical expertise, we listed C-suite engagement, knowing that that was a critical factor, analytics, research, education, marketing. And so at each stage, we defined in those squares, what does it feel like to be at that particular attribute in stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 progressively? And then we ended up grading ourselves, and we said, this is where we are today. And we put these robotic icons and grading ourselves and saying, this is where we are today. When the C-suite came in at the end of the day 3 for our summit, day 2 of our workshop, they asked the question, what is it that you want to be? And we showed them this maturity model. We said, this is where we are. And they said, where do you want to be? And we said, well, we really want to be mostly in world class, possibly some things still in stage 3, but that's where we want to be. The next dialogue moved to, when do you want to be there? And it almost became a case of, with the information that the surgeons had shared, that it was a race to get there. And so that had huge implications in our organization about what kind of resources we're going to be putting against it. And that's after the 3 days, the end of the 3-day summit, That's what led us to be so successful, to have such exponential growth. It was this sense of urgency based on the outcomes and the benefit and the surgeon recruitment and retention benefits that we were showing, that we really decided to accelerate our program with C-suite support and engagement. At the end of that time, we had this alignment that we had never had before. Previously, the surgeons and Intuitive had been pretty closely aligned, but there was this rift between surgery administration and the executives within our system. And now, after this summit, with our sharing of data and coming together, the ARMIS committee, this advanced robotic and minimally invasive committee that we now had, really brought them all together in this way that we had never had that kind of alignment. It built a foundation that was not like a foundation for a house. This was more like a foundation for a city that ultimately led to all those that big exponential growth that we had. One of the first things that happened coming out of this second S-curve for us was we just started thinking differently about robotically assisted surgery. We started looking at open surgeries and why is it that we are doing so many open procedures when we have minimally invasive approaches to be able to do, and knew that access was a big problem for us at the time. We started thinking about things like unfettered access for robotics, instead of managing these assets as a precious device that you basically don't buy very many of them and then use a heck out of them. What if we flip that model and move more to unfettered access? It allowed us to standardize our fleet. We ended up raising the bar on our credentialing, trying to address the dabblers that ultimately could lead to poorer outcomes, surgeons that would just do a few procedures a year, and started raising the bar for our credentialing. We added analytics capability because, as we found in the summit, we typically didn't even look at data that was differentiated for outcomes by open, lap, or robotic. We just looked at the procedure in total, or we looked at it by provider, but we never stratified the data in that way. We placed two robots in our hospital outpatient department ASCs. We substantially improved our physician recruitment and retention, especially in our regional hospitals that are out in smaller towns, out away from our hub, that sometimes have a hard time attracting a surgeon to those communities. And then one of the really big factors that happened coming out of the summit was our improved trust in Intuitive as a partner, understanding that ecosystem was really there to support us, and it was a hugely untapped asset for us. So our growth leading up to the summit was good, and it was nice that we had the diversity of service lines that we were using in our across the robots that we had. And then we had the summit in 2016, which led to ultimately some great growth, and again, really good spread across multiple specialties. And this is just the numbers for our Corewell Health West division, the Legacy Spectrum Health group, which is on the west side of Michigan, and we've since joined forces with a system on the east side as well as in Southwest Michigan. So the important things for us in our program, factors that led to our success, was to align the key stakeholders, knowing the right people that we had to have with us, which was finance, quality, the surgeons, of course, our executives, our C-suite, our surgery administration. All those people are important to bring together along with Intuitive to be able to get the right people there to help us. The next step we did was to build a plan, and it was a 30, 60, 90 plan. The important thing is to find out wherever you are and make some incremental progress. And again, you don't have to swing for the world-class kind of performance right away. Just make incremental improvements. And then lastly, deploy that ecosystem. There are so many resources that are available to be able to help you to build your robotic program. And Intuitive has those, whether it's teaching and training or access to data or benchmarking of other hospitals or connections and networks to people that are facing the same kind of problems or at the same part of their journey that you are. There's really a tremendous amount of resources there that are very valuable to you to be able to advance your program. So here we are, we've gone through two of these S-curves already, and kind of midway through the pandemic, I started asking the question, are we at a point where, even though we had great growth and we were still doing good things, the amount of pace that we had in our second S-curve was starting to flatten out a little bit. And the question was, what's going to be that next thing for us? And that prompted us to start asking some questions. And I asked the question of some of our internal people. I ask questions of surgeons, and I ask intuitive, what is that next S curve likely to be for us? And we thought about some of the problems that we're trying to solve, and we put together a summit. We put together another summit in 2022 to be able to address this and get our heads around this. And the problems we were trying to solve were, we know that staffing shortages by the end of 22 was a really big issue. And how can we manage that staffing challenge, especially in a program that was kind of known for being resource heavy? We also believe we were at an inflection point between analog surgery and digital surgery. There were so many capabilities that were starting to be shown in the market that were moving at a very fast pace. A lot of private equity and venture capital investment. We were hearing more and more about digital, the digital impact on surgery, and wanted to know more about that. And then finally, many of our assets, our rooms, the way in which we did our capital purchases were all really designed around legacy surgical approaches, and we had to rethink that. Regarding the staffing, we had two different forces that were coming at us in 2022. One was the historically robotic procedures always required extra people, and it was a legacy thing back to when there was a new technology, and we felt like that had to be there had to be extra resources available because it was complex, it was different, it was new, and we just kind of would always tend to put an extra person in a robot room, and that became the standard of what everyone expected. We also had difficulties with staffing. We had more people leaving the industry than we had joining, especially in the surgical technologist roles. We just were not able to add staff, and we had to be able to do more with less. At the same time, we had these building pressures for things like adding 24/7 access to the robots. We had a surgeon that asked one time, why should a patient suffer a different outcome based on the time they come through our door, that we only run our robots on a weekdays from say 7:30 to 3:30 or 4, and then if they come in after that, they have to have an open or lap procedure. And they were asking that question from a health equity standpoint. Why would that have to affect a patient's outcome? Because they were feeling more and more confident about their outcomes robotically. And so there were potential pressures to add staff when you think about 24/7 staffing and the nighttime and the call coverage. When you're in a smaller hospital, you don't have a big enough pool to spread call at nights and weekends. And so it felt like we had this pressure to add people, and yet we're in this environment of incredible short staffing. So we ended up tackling that problem together and identified some ways that we could really disrupt in the status quo and think about things differently. One of the things you have to be able to do is understand what your state and if there are any kind of legislative things that affect your number of staffing. There are states that have those that require certain staffing levels in the OR and positions. And then there's other things like ours that was essentially dogma that said you have to have 3 people in a robotic case. And we started challenging that and say, where did that come from and why is that? In our case in Michigan, that wasn't a case where it was legislatively required. But it does require that you have to understand that. So when you start thinking about your staffing, you've got to really be able to understand where did those rules come from, and are they really what you think they are, or is there some flexibility for you, which there has to be as we move forward in this kind of value-based environment. Also, you've got to find a surgeon champion, because when you do these kind of changes where you're potentially talking about, optimizing staffing or doing more with less, oftentimes people equate that to an intentional loss in quality of your services. And it doesn't have to be that way. It can't be that way in value-based healthcare, but you need a surgeon that's going to be able to understand that, what that means to have that kind of tension between unlimited resources and being financially responsible. You need to have ongoing discussions at your robotic or your Da Vinci steering committee meetings. You need to train teams to be comfortable with operating with basically one less person in a room, which is what we did. We moved from 3 in a room to 2 in a room, and have now since spread that to our whole system. I gave our team a deadline of December 31st when I wanted that in place. And I thought originally they were going to come back asking for more resources. And the reality is they got creative and thought of a different way to do our current robotic staffing, where we were able to leverage the team that we had. challenge the leadership to step outside of their comfort zone, share the importance of reduced staffing and what that means and what value-based healthcare means and how we can't keep adding cost into healthcare as there are more and more pressures on the top line with reimbursement. Measure and validate the outcomes, which we have done and been able to identify. We didn't have any impact on room turnover or outcomes by doing that. And then expand your pilot. So we did a pilot in an ASC where we could kind of control the experiment, and we are now spreading the staffing savings throughout, as well as our 24/7 coverage. So when I think of value in healthcare, I think of improved outcomes at a lower total cost of care. And in our case, it's important to know that we were able to reduce one person from what was kind of our traditional robotic staffing. We also were able to increase volume with the same number of FTEs. And then we know that we have great care. We haven't reduced anything in terms of our length of stay, our readmissions, our surgical site infections. And ultimately, this is going to lead to increased patient output. So coming out of our summit, we basically made this declaration that we're moving into this era of digital surgery. And I define that in two parts. One is looking backwards by harnessing the data that we have. There's so much information that we have, so much data that we have, and how do we convert that into useful information we can make decisions on? And we feel that's a really important part, kind of looking back at that data, mining that data, and being able to draw conclusions that'll influence our decisions going forward. And then there's another part of that, which is really the anticipation or the predictive part of that we can leverage in robotics and digital surgery to help us identify in the moment when there's something that's going to happen and how we can change course to improve outcomes. So when we talk about that, and I talk about the new S curve, there's a lot of things along that. And we wanted to convey to the C-suite that was at the summit that when we come asking for things, it's not because we just fell in love with the next item that came our way or that we're reacting, that there's an intentional strategy for us to move forward. There are many things that are already available, like the CHA agreement for, which is essentially like an MIS registry that already exists. There's apps, there's image capture items that are available already. And then there's things all the way up, really advanced applications of AI and ultimately leading to the potential for remote surgery, whether that is, a physician outside a room or down the street or potentially in a different state or reaching out to smaller rural hospitals that can have this kind of technology. That's the type of stuff that's going to be possible with digital surgery that would have never been possible with open or lab surgery. And ultimately, all these things are supporting our quintuple aim. So the next part I'm going to talk about is forecasting your fleet. So going into the summit, I asked a question about, okay, I understand where we are today from open lap and robotic in terms of our mix of cases, but what is that going to look like in 10 years? And we initially tried to make some estimates of that and realized we really needed to do some better forecasting. And so we essentially took every hospital we had, started with a mix between open, lap, and robotic, and then started making some assumptions each year and just moving out and saying, here's our historical trend line. We had been decreasing both lap and open over time, increasing robots. And we did this exercise as if capacity wasn't a constraint, as if we had access to the technology we need. And we also looked at things like surgeons and when they were going to be retiring, and if they were, largely a lap or open surgeon, would they be replaced by a surgeon that would be robotically trained? And what would that case migration look like over the 10 years? Across our entire system for Corewell Health, we have 42 robots today. We have 163 lap towers across about 240 ORs in our whole system, about 22 hospitals. And so when we did the fleet forecasting for the robotic surgeries, we ended up seeing that we would be at about 114 robots in 10 years. That's where my opening line came from of 100 robots in 10 years. That's a big number for us. And yet we have looked at this a number of times, and you can tweak the example or the data here and there, but the answer always comes out to something pretty close to that 114 number. Which is really a big deal for us over that time. The question is, on the 163, we would have, of the lap towers, we have historically not exactly had a lap tower in every OR, but, probably 2/3 of them have lab towers. And we have a life cycle refresh plan where when those are old and they come up for renewal, we'll go ahead and replace those. So we took a look at, obviously, our robotic utilization is high, like a lot of you would have in your programs, 80 to 90% utilization, because it was an expensive asset. We didn't have many of them, and we wanted to make sure we were using the full value out of them. That's the way most of our robots were being utilized, and it was really no surprise. But then we started asking the question, well, if the lab volume has been declining over time, then what does the utilization look like on our lab towers? And we did that assessment. We had never looked at it before, and our utilization on our lab towers is between 15 and 40%, which was really disappointing to be able to see, and it was pretty humbling. And it made us ask the question, have we just been running on autopilot replacing these lab towers because it's just a given for 35 or 40 years? We've had lab towers, and you just always have one in a room. Some are fixed, some are mobile. And we started asking the question, why are we managing those assets differently than we would a new asset like a robot? And so it led us to do some different modeling. And that was, what if we utilized our lab towers at 80%, but would never let a hospital go to less than one? They would always have at least one as a floor in their hospital, whether they were 3 rooms or 15-room OR, they would never have less than one. And the results of that fleet forecasting showed that we could essentially in 10 years drop our lab fleet from 163 down to 67. Now within that 67 number, 44 of those are for non-traditional surgery, things like arthroscopies and cystos and other things where you need the scope to be able to perform the surgery, but it's not a traditional abdominal or thoracic surgery. And so only 23 of those in our forecasts are going to be needed for those type of surgeries. 44 of those are going to be for these other type of surgeries that we're not even sure that a conventional lab tower would be the right way to do those procedures in the future. Reducing 100 lab towers over 10 years by being able to avoid those purchases, we forecast our lab tower cost to be around $170,000. That does not include the monitors and the visualization that you will still need in a digital environment. So just the lab tower portion alone would result in about a $17 million capital avoidance going forward. This fleet forecasting was really an interesting thing for us to do and raised a lot of questions. And frankly, it's changed the way that we look at life cycle refresh going forward for lab towers. We're anticipating that in 10 years, the whole story may end up flipping back to the way robots were 5-10 years ago, where you had this precious asset that you were highly utilizing. You only ran it during the week because that's the only time you had people there that knew how to use it, and you would move this asset around basically to try to optimize its use. We anticipate that lab towers are likely to be that way in 10 years. Maybe hard to find staff that still know how to operate the equipment, or find surgeons that know how to operate that outside of the arthroscopies and things like that. So that's kind of the inflection point that we see happening between robotic and analog or lab and open surgeries. So coming out of our summit, we had 3 really big takeaways. The first one was about this volume, about moving forward with intention and knowing that our fleet needs were going to be really substantial. There are a lot of different options for being able to acquire robots. And if your numbers add up to our numbers, that's a big acquisition. That's a lot of capital that the organization would have to commit. There are ways of doing that, whether it be straight outright capital commitments, there could be traditional financial leases or other flexible acquisition agreements that Intuitive has made available to allow health systems to be able to have the kind of access that they need. The next thing we know we need to do, and that we declared in the summit, is we've got to lead intentionally through this change from the analog world in surgery to a digital world. And we've got to think differently about how we manage these assets and move more into unfettered access for robotics like we have historically had on lab. Originally, lab wasn't that way. There was, constraints on the initial investments for lab, and eventually it got to unfettered access. And now we basically need to start inverting those 2 worlds. And then finally, for us, it was really important for us to be able to challenge our team. And so coming out of the back half of our second summit, we pulled a group together. This was the first time that we had come together across the integration of 3 new systems. And so part of our summit time that we dedicated was getting this group together and say, what are the kind of things in an overall robotic steering committee for our whole Corewell Health organization? What are the type of things that we could do better together than we're doing today separately? And so we identified a number of things that we would work on together going forward in this Corewell Health robotic committee that we formed coming out of the summit. The foundational elements that were so important to us were making sure you have the right key stakeholders. That's something that we've identified multiple times, whether it's the C-suite, the surgeons, the surgery administration, quality and safety, finance, the intuitive ecosystem. Bringing those people together is just critical for the success of a program. Using the maturity model to identify and communicate in a simple way, here's where we are, here's where we want to be, and here's when we want to be there, will drive some really powerful discussions with your executive team. Not every program can be at world class, but having that kind of discussion, showing the type of outcomes that you have, showing how those outcomes align with your mission to drive greater value, improved outcomes at a lower total cost of care, can really get a great amount of support from executives that otherwise wouldn't probably be able to understand all the complexity of what's going on in your robotic program. Building a plan to match your overall strategy. So once you understand what that gap plan is, do it in small chunks, 30, 60, 90-day plans, make progress, start moving instead of saying, well, we have to get to world class and that's going to be 5 years out, so there's no point in doing anything now. There's lots and lots of things you can do in a short time frame. The other part is to leverage the ecosystem. There are so many resources that are available through the intuitive ecosystem that can really help you both build your confidence as well as solve a lot of problems that you're facing that other people have solved, and they can make connections with you with other health systems and help you through those with greater confidence. And then finally, forecasting your future needs, just asking that question, where are we going to be in 10 years with our mix, and trying to model your fleet out in your mix of procedures is a super powerful exercise. Something that we're doing not only in this space, but we're starting to expand that into other things within surgical services. So in summary, these are the key parts that really have driven our program. And when I introduced myself at the beginning, I introduced myself about who I was in the past as I started my robotic journey, someone that was curious and doubtful and skeptical, but really kind of interested in learning more about this world. And I hope you can see more now as we've gone through this journey, how this has affected me and the person that I am basically now at this part of our journey. We've got lots of work yet to do, but we're really excited about where we are today. And I'm really proud to be able to share the progress that we've made at Corewell Health in our robotic program. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That is all the time we have for today. I want to thank John Scholl for his time, thoughtfulness, and insights today. I also want to thank Intuitive for sponsoring today's featured session. And to our attendees who joined us, thank you for making time to be part of our 13th annual meeting virtual event. Make sure you check out the other amazing sessions we have going on during this event, and please be sure to let us know if you have any questions, comments, or feedback. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at future Becker's events.